Um, Recent issues around race that we've experienced, um, not just Black Lives Matter, not just sort of systemic or algorithmic bias, but how you said already you're quite optimistic in one domain. How optimistic are you that we can sort of take race with the requisite seriousness without getting lost somehow in perpetual guilt or critique or whatever the problem would be of staying with it too much? How can we get to the optimal level of being aware of race as an issue without being and redressing it? And you help me out here. How can we get to the
Yeah.
place we want to be on race?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think in some ways it's always a bit tricky to kind of view it from the lens of kind of holding on to guilt, right? I think in some ways, right, there's a kind of two-part problem. I think it's like for I think most people of color, like we want recognition and acknowledgement of like equal standing in society, right? But in pursuit of that has to be an acknowledgement of past harms. And I find that people sometimes struggle with those two things in tandem, right? Some people are really about equality, but are really against like recognition of historical harms. But the two are in tandem, right? To understand someone's lived experience, right, is not enough to say, well, I view you as the equal, right, but I don't understand why. And I guess as it relates to our kind of discussion around like algorithm systems, right, you could tell a system it is fair, but if you don't understand, like you can't explain why, then it's very difficult to kind of have a real understanding or explainability as to the decisions that you'll make in the future, right? And I think that's the first step. And I think like and I would say that it seems like a form of your question is like being a good ally in this conversation.
Mm.
And I think part of it is actually doing that education, right? I find that a lot of people of color have to do the additional emotional labor of trying to be the educator and producers of evidence about the historical harms. But these things are in plain view, they're not hidden.
Yeah.
And so I think it would be important to understand the full history of colonialism, right, of systemic racism, and be able to engage with that material. And I think I would be surprised if people come away from doing that kind of education to kind of come with a different interpretation of like what it would take to get your peers in the Black community to feel as equals, to feel as like you're on the same footing. Because I think when you understand it, you understand the remedies for that are very different,
Right.
right? Non-discrimination is great, but that's the difference between equality and equity, right? Like to get equity, you have to kind, and it's not an easy. I would say it's not trivial to kind of like say, well, if I just read the history, I will understand what to do, because it's actually, I mean, it is a difficult challenge. It's not easy, but I think what I have seen from the recent like protests and the kind of kind of things that have flowed from that is a willingness to engage in that discussion, right? To actually think about the kind of historical legacy, what it means, and what society we want. And I think if we want a society where everyone is treated equal, where everyone is given a fair opportunity to advance, then we know that part of that is going to have to be dismantling systems that have for so long perpetuated and oppressed groups, and try to reimagine what society should look like. And that's going to look different than what society looks like today, but that's okay. Like, I just imagine, someone who works in technology, I try to also be a student of technology. And if you go back in a time machine 10, 15 years, we had no Facebook, no Twitter, no iPhone, right? And if you were to tell someone that time point about the world to now, they would not believe that it would be possible, right? That everyone would be walking around with like, $1,000 phone in their pockets, right? That's like the same power as like a supercomputer, like, from the 80s, right? It just would seem unfathomable, right? But it happened. So I think we can also do it in other domains of our life, right? Like we can change, like the vision of the world we want that is just is possible, right? It's not easy, but the world can change. And I think that's the kind of spirit that we need to take with it, and acknowledge that it will be difficult. it requires deep thinking. It requires the humbleness, and I think that will be, I think we'll see if that emerges. But I guess I'm more optimistic than those because I think there's a lot of people who seem invested in changing, in redesigning the way we kind of construct our society.
I'm so happy you're optimistic. And as you were speaking there, I'm reminded of two things to close on. One is you've just written a paper on connecting your work in machine learning with decolonial thinking and critical race theory and so forth, which I'm looking forward to reading before asking you about again. And secondly, we actually spent some time together on Gorée Island. So in terms of getting to at least some experiential access to some of the roots of these issues, that was a happy memory to share. Look, I'd love to speak to you again, William, and I'm very grateful for your time. Thanks a lot, and talk to you later.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Let me just